This is International Trade, Week 9. In this lecture, we're going to again take a look at the real world, and we're going to first have a very short discussion about regional trade integration in Africa. There is a lot of literature out there, and I think it is time to summarize it. And then we are going to take a look at the WTO, the World Trade Organization. What is it? What is it for? Why do we need it? And within the framework of the World Trade Organization, we will have a look at the Swiss formula, which is a formula to negotiate trade. If you take a look at the literature dealing with regional integration in Africa, as you know, this experience is not new for many African countries. South Africa itself currently is a party to 8 different regional trade agreements. Then what shows very clearly is that most African countries are still sticking to import substitution in a number of industries, not only in manufacturing. So that they're not very much interested in opening the economy for competition. The problem with import substitution, if you protect a market, is that in many cases you even stop competition in the domestic market. And this, as we know, as economists, is not acceptable because we need the competition. Yes, if you are the CEO of a company, you will only become more efficient or do everything it takes for your company to become more efficient if you know that competition is watching you. Yes, if there is nobody watching you, and if there are high trade barriers, then you can even increase the price and you don't worry much about your costs. And this is the problem. You don't worry much about innovation. You just use old technology because there is no competition. There is no one who will show you that there are better machines to produce the goods or that there are better goods that can be produced. Yes, there is absolutely no competition there. And this is the situation not in all, but in some countries on the African continent. And I think that the most important consequence is that many people have the impression that African countries produce the same goods, yes, the same commodities. And this is, of course, not true. Yes, if you, for example, take a look at consumer goods, yes, then you will find out that every country has, products that have been derived from the country's culture, and these are things that could be offered on an international level. Yes, so for example, South African special goods, yes, could be exported to the neighboring countries, and South Africa could import, yes, some of the typical goods of the neighboring countries, yes. So you can have this in the area of foodstuffs, you can have this in the area of textiles, you can have this in several areas, yes. So there is potential, there is scope for trade, but import substitution has killed the potential for exchange. So if you take a look at the literature, you will find a lot of failures, but you will also find some countries that fared very, very well. And the issue is to try to have more countries that benefit from opening their markets to firms from other African countries. Well, let's now have a look at the WTO, the World Trade Organization. What is, basically speaking, the problem of trade? As you know, most countries want to benefit from trade. But many want to protect domestic firms at the expense of others, at the expense of foreigners, by levying tariffs or using other trade barriers that do not favor goods and services and firms from other countries. And this, of course, applies also to the neighbor countries. The problem with this stance, yes, with this policy position, is that it is very short-sighted. Why? What would happen if all countries do the same? Imagine a two-country world, yes, if both countries protect themselves. Well, all countries would lose by doing that, yes, by protecting, and protecting has not cooperating. And if you, as a country, don't want to cooperate with other countries, then you are in a prisoner's dilemma, which is a famous theorem from game theory. And I hope that all of you know exactly what the prisoner's dilemma is, something that you generally learn in the first year microeconomics, or if not, in the first, in the second. Let's take a look at what happens in a two-country world, and let's call what might happen between two countries a trade war. In this table, you can see the gains and the losses of two countries, countries A and B. Let me take a look at the first column. The first column here, you have free trade A, free trade B, protection A, protection B. The next column shows free trade for A, free trade for B, protection for A, and protection for B. Let's go back to country A. Country A, in this cell, chooses free trade. And let's assume that country A trades with country B, and that country B also has chosen free trade as its trade policy. The result is a gain of 10 units of, you name it, any currency or something. Let's go to country B. And let's again assume that country B also chooses free trade, and that it trades with country A that also has chosen free trade. The result is a gain of 10 units for country B. Now, what happens if country A chooses protection as an economic policy? Well, if it continues to trade with country B and country B sticks to free trade, then A gains 20 units. It has protected, it has shut its market, but it is still exporting to the other country, B, that keeps its markets open. So country A is exploiting country B, right? Now, the same happens if country B chooses protection and continues to trade with country A, and country A is still in the realm of free trade. You see again a gain of 20 units. Now let's assume that country A chooses protection, but also wants to trade with country B, and country B also chooses protection as economic policy. What we see here is a loss of 5 units. The same happens if country B chooses protection and wants to trade with country A that also chooses protection. So both countries have the highest loss. So a world in which all countries protect leads to losses in welfare, to losses in income, to losses in distribution of income. So the only way to earn a gain as a protectionist country is at the expense of free traders. So the problem is to choose free trade, if possible, and to try to liberalize trade. The only solution, the only recommendable solution to the trade problem is cooperation. Negotiate with other countries in order to reduce trade barriers together. Yes, so it's not fair to open up your market if all other countries protect. So the only alternative and the only way out of the prisoner's dilemma is to negotiate, to sit down and negotiate with other countries. So if a pair of countries agree to liberalize, each one of them might worry that the other one offers better deals to third countries, right? So that is why there is something called the most favored nation principle, MFN. To offer trade partners tariff reductions that will also be offered to third countries. Yes, so to try to offer preferences not only to one country, but to keep these preferences open to third countries. If you do this, this is tantamount to enter into regional or multilateral negotiations to reduce trade barriers and increase the gains from trade for all participating countries. And that is exactly what the WTO are about. GATT is the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs. It refers particularly to goods, and the GATT is the General Agreements on Trade and Services. These are the core pillars of the WTO, GATT and GATS. In many cases, particularly in developing countries, tariffs are also used as a source of revenue for the budget. But as we just heard, protection can also damage a country. It can damage, it's bad for welfare, it's bad for consumers, it's bad for producers, and it's also bad for the government. So it's much better to look for other sources of revenue, to have a tax reform, and to see what can be done. The downside of tariffs is that the day that you introduce a tariff, yes, it invites other countries to retaliate, to do the same to you. And nowadays, it doesn't take more than a few seconds for other countries to get the information in a digital world that you have levied a tariff. If a region or the world economy should be in the middle of a downswing, well, if all countries protect, then economies might not recover well from downswings. And recessions might deepen further, like during the Great Depression, 1929 to 1933. So what does the WTO do? It sets rules for countries to follow in their trade policies. The enforcement rules are rather weak. Why? Because you need voluntarily reforms, trade policy reforms. Yes, it's not the obligation. It's not something that you can do perforce by force. It's not good to force a country into a certain policy. The WTO also has a dispute settlement mechanism. Yes, so if countries trade with each other, then sometimes opportunities arise where disputes have to be settled. And so the WTO, in its framework, has a dispute settlement mechanism. It also hosts rounds of trade negotiations to reduce trade barriers. And generally does so on a multilateral level. Which means for all WTO members, currently we have 164 members. The latest round, however, which ran from 2001 to 2015, failed. Many others were very successful to reduce the average tariff rates in the world economy. And most developed countries nowadays have relatively low tariffs. In addition to multilateral rounds of trade negotiations, it also hosts plurilateral rounds of negotiations. Plurilateral are not obligatory for all member countries, just for those members who are interested, yes, who are willing to participate. Formerly, trade negotiations rounds were about cutting tariffs between leading supplier and leading demand countries. Tariff cuts were extended to all WTO members based on the MFN principle. Another fundamental WTO principle is national treatment. What does that mean? It means that you are committed to treat foreign goods and services like domestic ones. No discrimination of foreigners. More recently, trade negotiations begin using a tariff formula and then move on to negotiate exceptions to the formula. You're going to see the formula in a minute. Tariff negotiations are generally about binding tariffs to which member countries commit themselves. They're maximum tariffs. This means that a country is able to reduce its tariffs as it wants, but not to increase it over the level of the binding tariff. Most important agreements which countries have to sign and ratify upon becoming member of WTO are the GATS, and, very important, the TRIPS. TRIPS are the trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights. On a plurilateral level, the most important agreements on information technology, financial services, basic telecommunication services, and anti-counterfeiting trade. Now let's take a look at the Swiss formula, a very easy formula. Well, Z is the resulting lower tariff rate. A is a coefficient, and particularly it's the maximum tariff rate. And higher case X is the initial tariff rate. So these variables you see in the numerator, they also appear in the denominator as a summation. Yes, maximum tariff rate plus the initial tariff rate. Let us take a look at some examples. So imagine the highest tariff rate is 40%, and the current average level is 30%. Then we just multiply both here and we add them and we carry out the division. What we get is 17%. What does this mean? A country that has a current level of 30%, yes, should reduce this level to 17%. Now, let's take the case of a country that has initially a lower level, 20%. Well, the 20% country has to reduce, according to the formula, its average tariff level to 13%. So you see what happens here if you have a higher level and if you have a lower level. So the lower has to reduce from 30 to 17. The lower level has to reduce from 20 to 13. So the greatest reduction is here. And we said, in this case, 40% is the highest tariff. Then let's assume that the highest tariff is 60%. And let's have the two levels of current average tariff rates, 30% and 20%. So if the highest tariff is 60%, then to reduce the current level of 30% would mean to go down to 20%, from 30 to 20. And if the current level is 20%, we go down to 15. So here you see what happens to developing countries. Developing countries are allowed to specify higher maximum tariff rates. So if you're allowed to have higher maximum tariff rates, the reduction is not so fast. So for developing countries, a higher value of A is allowed, which means that tariff reductions resulting from the Swiss formula are lower for developing countries than for developed countries. Now, although there are several modifications of the Swiss formula in the literature, the most important point is to have a formula that is accepted by all negotiating parties. Yes, this formula is just a rule to determine tariff levels in the negotiations. Yes, so tariffs don't appear as a result of blue sky thinking. Yes, they should be ruled, determined. Let me conclude. The WTO is a key organization as part of the system of the United Nations. It offers a rules-based framework for goods and services trade. It entails a mechanism for dispute settlement, and its fundamental principles, MFN, most favored nation, and national treatment benefit all trading nations. The current challenge faced by the WTO is to adapt the rules that exist for world trade to climate change. What is the scope for further research? As we have mentioned at different stages in this lecture. Research about the benefits for developing countries. Yes, needs to be done. Much more research is needed to better understand the negotiating strategies of developing countries. Thank you very much.